Hello and welcome to The Storied Human. Today, my guest is Richard Perkins Hsung. He was born in China in 1966 and was one of the first teens to leave China legally under Mao's Cultural Revolution. He earned a PhD in chemistry from the University of Chicago and became a professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, retiring in 2022. He spent 10 years editing and completing Spring Flower by his mother, Jean Tren-Hwa Perkins, MD. The three-volume memoir chronicles her life as an adopted child of American medical missionaries, a survivor of China's brutal communist regime, an ophthalmologist, an immigrant, and a mother. Hsung lives in Madison, Wisconsin with his wife, where keeping squirrels from digging up his backyard has become a daily scientific obsession. And I'm sure we can relate to that one. I can't wait to unpack your story and hear more about it. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much, Len, for having me on your show.
It's so good to have you. So there's so much to talk about. How old were you when you were allowed to leave China legally?
So I was 14, and then I turned 15 shortly after we arrived in the States. Yeah,
Oh,
that will
oh
be
my
1980.
gosh, so young. And that must have been like
Right.
ridiculous, like such a change, right?
I know. I often thought I was a grown-up at the time, and then now that I look back on, I was definitely just a kid. Or it was age where a person understands pretty much everything, but also at the same time understands next to nothing. And I was right at it. Yeah.
It's so true. It's like you're smart by then, right? But you have no experience.
Yeah. You have a good sense of whereabouts, but then you try to grapple with what, why, and how and where. Yeah. Mhm.
What was that like for you? I mean, it's such a change. It's such a huge change from one culture to another.
Yeah, so it was a it was a storm that blinded me, and I was not prepared for any of that. And of course, the leaving China and coming to the States completely changed my life and changed the trajectory or path of my life. And uh, essentially, I had to start from ground zero because I didn't know a word of English at the time, even though my mother
Goodness.
spoke English as if English was her first language. Right? So, mm,
Wow, that's helpful anyway, right? So did you
uh,
live with your
completely. Yeah.
so you did you live with your grandmother here?
So by the time my mother returned home to America and brought me in 1980, her parents or my American grandparents had long passed away. One passed away in 1958, and my American grandmother passed away in 1961 or 62. I forgot, 63 maybe. And so, but we have a lot of American relatives and who were responsible for getting us out of China. Right. So.
That's thank God for that. So did you find it I mean, you're
Yeah.
obviously very academically oriented and you did well in school. Did that help? I mean, did you find a refuge in school and you learned English?
Um, yeah, so it was bizarre, right? And I guess I was in junior high when I was uprooted from my classroom, and most of my classmates in China had no idea where I went. I just disappeared.
Oh my
And,
gosh.
then I found myself on this Pan Am flight en route to JFK in 1980. And while on the plane, my mother was trying to give me a crash course in English and also
Oh
her
my
her
gosh.
life history. And so by the time I got to New York and we spent some time in New York and then we settled down in Boston where she was a research fellow at the Mass General Hospital. So I was quickly enrolled in this one of the actually more prestigious high school called Milton Academy, Massachusetts.
Right.
It was bizarre that how they try to figure out where I should be. So I was sitting at one point with ninth grader, even though I was supposed to be a 10th grader, I guess. And then pretty soon I was in the third grade English class trying to
Oh
figure things
no.
out. Yeah, so before I left China, I was becoming pretty good at writing. I loved the history and I wanted to be a journalist. And of course, coming to America effectively ended that. And I couldn't write any sentences, properly at the time. And
That's
so pretty soon I figured out, math is international language, science is,
yes.
so I was sort of forced into that track because it
Yes.
was just easier to deal with. And so eventually I took a career in chemistry. It was also because, well, it was easier to understand. And so I'm very grateful to have a career like that for about almost 30 years teaching chemistry, teaching and researching chemistry. But it was not what I had in mind
Right.
40 years ago, 50 years ago. Yeah.
I think that's pretty amazing that you could make that shift and that you were that good in chemistry. I mean, in math, a lot of us couldn't. Right. I mean, really, I'm a writer and I don't know if I could become a chemistry professor. Excuse me. So that's amazing right there that you have those talents and that you can make that shift. And I think that I think a lot of times education can save us. It really can. It can give us a refuge. And I think, we're lucky to have people that are able to do what you can do. So tell me, how much of your mother's story did you know then when you were a very young man?
Yeah, so after we settled down in Boston, and then I guess within the first few years, she started to contemplate about writing her memoir, or at
Hmm.
least put her put the stories of her life down on paper. And she had a lot of encouragement, ranging from our American relatives and so on. This is amazing story. You gotta write a book about it. To a lot of people that just from her working place and so on. And then so she inherited boxes of letters her mother had written back in the 1930s and 40s. And then my mother herself had this incredible photographic memory of her childhood also.
Wow.
And then also my American grandmother was an amateur photographer and took many thousands of photos of China. And so
Wow.
she had all those materials and she started to organize them. And then I had nothing better to do. So I was helping her at the time. And then through that process, I started to learn more about how she was adopted by American medical missionaries and how she spent some time in the States during the World War II, and how she was trapped in China for 30 years prior
Oh my
to
gosh.
the States and brought me over also. Yeah. So that was my first, I guess, lessons of her
Yeah.
life. Yeah.
30 years. My God.
Yes. 1950 to 1980.
And
Full,
she
like,
wasn't allowed to leave.
yeah, there was no way. A lot of people actually tried, and many
Right.
died while trying. And
Right.
he attempted to, but she was talked out of it by my father because it was
Oh.
suicide. Right? So,
And what did your father do?
so my father was a professor of agriculture, I guess, agronomist, and he specialized in rice research. And he was among the earliest generation in the 1950s and understood how to do cross-breeding hybrids and actually genetically modify the rice so that it will be bigger, fuller, and more nutrition, I guess, all that stuff. I
Wow.
mean, it's controversial too, but point is that he was very ambitious. He wanted to solve a world hunger problem. At least famine was an issue in China. Right? So
Yes.
and he became a world-renowned agronomist by 1980s and 1990s. So of course, yeah. So that was pretty much his life and career. I saw very little of him. Of course, by the time I knew I began to get to know him, I was on a Pan Am flight. Right? So
Oh,
he and I didn't really have much of a relationship, unlike my mother and I. Yeah.
yeah. Sometimes that happens. But still, you must have felt like you had big shoes to fill, right? You're,
Yes, especially my mother's. I know my father. My father was quite reasonable whenever he and I had opportunities to interact. He didn't have that high of expectations, but my mother did. My mother had held me to some of the highest, most unreasonable expectations, especially during our time in the States. I guess, yeah, I was to fulfill her dreams. I guess,
ah,
yeah.
was that, did you feel like, did that feel natural or did that feel like a little bit of pressure?
I still feel the pressure. I'm over the years, I've been trying to shed this burden, brick by brick, but I still got plenty of bricks in this bag. I'm still on my shoulder, right? So,
That's such a
but yeah,
good,
I think
yeah,
somehow writing, completing her memoir has helped. It was a very
yeah,
redemptive exercise for me, and in some ways, I'm hoping that uh, she's up there somewhere, right? I'm hoping
yeah.
she will be proud of me and the
I'm
fact that
sure she is. So
I could
tell
finish it.
us, when did it occur to you that you could finish this? And how much did she have done when she passed away?
So she spent about 12 years from the early 1980s to about mid 1990s or early 1990s. And then by the time she passed away, my father handed me three boxes of her manuscripts and notes
Wow.
and it was over 1,000 pages
Wow.
and just lots of stuff to go through. And that would be 2014 spring or 2014.
Mhm.
And that was just about pretty much when I began the process. And of course, at the time, I thought I could continue my career and doing this at the same time. And
Sure.
within a few years, it became impossible to do both. I had to start consider maybe quitting my career just to finish her memoir. So it took
Yeah.
me about 10 years, just a little south of 10 years.
Yeah.
To do that. Yeah.
Well, it just sounds like so much of it in the beginning was like being an archivist, right? That takes so much time,
Yes.
organizing and comprehending what you have and categorizing. And I don't think people understand that kind of work takes such a long time.
Yeah, I love the word archive, and that was pretty much her style of writing, which was very annoying actually. And I follow that style. It's much less a memoir. It was more archive or chronicles or chronicles of history,
Yeah.
chronicles of her life. Very detailed, and so I had
Yeah.
to read through all of that, which was good because I needed to
Yeah.
find her voice before I start
Yeah.
writing or editing, and also completing. And so. Yeah, thousands of pages to thumb through, and in some ways, I had a good start, but there were so many gaps I had to fill. So I had to interview a lot of people, and I interviewed my father was one of them, and I had to ask many stories in at least from 1950s and 1960s prior to I was born, and
Thank
yeah,
goodness you
he did a
had your
good job.
father. Like sometimes
Yeah.
I think that's, if you wait too long to tell a story, everyone's gone, right? It's just really good you had your dad.
And sadly, he was gone shortly after he was telling me
Oh,
about that. So he passed away in 2015. So they passed away about 9 months apart or 10 months apart.
oh, that's so
But I had
hard. I'm so
enough
sorry.
headline. Oh, thank you. He gave me enough headlines, and then I could interview a lot of. I went back to China. I made many trips to China. I interviewed a lot of people there, just to fill in the gaps and to understand the history better, I guess. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a lot of work, and plenty of moments I regretted. It's like,
Oh,
what are you
that
thinking about, Richard?
it's a killer commitment, right? And like sometimes we make these commitments in the best of frame of mind, and then we're like in the middle of it, and we say, "What did I get myself
Yeah,
into?" But I just
yeah,
feel
true.
throughout your story that there was this enduring connection to your mother, and this obligation in the most loving way. Like you were compelled to finish for her.
Yes, I think so. It was a promise I made to her, but although not casually, but of course at the time when I promised her, I had no idea what this was about. So, yeah, so she was dying in nursing home from dementia. So, was wondering why she was just hanging on and not just go, right? And then so I said, how about, I know you probably just wonder who's ever going to finish your memoir, and if anyone, it will be me, right? Nobody else will be able
Right.
to do this. Even my father, before he died, he said that, I should try it. I tried to write this memoir in Chinese, and I couldn't do it after a couple months. So then,
Oh my
so then
goodness.
so it will be up to me. And so when I did that, I thought, oh yeah, I'll just do that, on the weekends and nights, have fun. That was very naive. Yeah.
Well, these things do tend to take over our lives. I mean, she has such a, what a huge story. And there's so much historical backdrop. So why
Yeah.
don't you just tell me briefly?
Mhm.
I'm wondering, how did she get stuck in China? Like, how did that happen?
Yes. So I will start from there. Maybe I'll backtrack a little bit. So
Okay.
that will be January 1951. Really, actually January 1, 1951. Her parents were driven out of China overnight. Within 3 days, they were shipped to Canton and then across the harbor went to Hong Kong. And because Korean conflict was reaching its peak, and that was a proxy war between America and China on
Right.
Korean peninsula. And even though it involved 17 other countries, but the point it was mainly China
Right.
killing Americans. Yeah, so right, Korean War on Korean Peninsula. And so my mother, at the time when her American parents were on a train en route to Canton and Hong Kong, my mother was a freshman in an English-speaking college in a city pretty close to Shanghai called Nanking, but 300 miles away from her parents. So she couldn't make it. And even she made it, in hindsight, now that I know her story, she wouldn't have the proper paperwork, like a passport at the time to leave the country. Her parents did, right? They were Americans. And so, yeah, so then she was trapped. And then, at the time they thought that she thought that it would just be a short term, right? A couple years later, the war will end and she will be reunited with her parents. But maybe a blink of eyes, 3 decades. And so why was she back in China? When she had spent 3 years living in Yonkers, New York, during the
Oh my
wartime.
goodness.
That's because her parents were just totally dedicated, uh, medical missionaries. And when World War II ended, or at least for the VE Day, when the European theater ended in 1945, in May of 1945, her parents uprooted her from her classroom in,
Oh,
in Yonkers, New York, and she found herself on a battleship en route to India. And so, make a long story short, 1946, they went back to China, and her parents just want to continue their medical missions. And so, but they didn't know China was going to endure through a 3 year period of civil war between communist armies, and at the time the government is called National Republic Nationalist, and so they fought each other for 3 years, and the communists then won the war, swept through South, and next thing you know, uh, her parents were thinking about leaving China. However, communists at the time in 1949 were quite reasonable. Of course, they needed the physicians, right? They needed the competent doctors and hospitals.
makes
So they
sense.
allowed my grandparents to keep on operating the hospital, so the hospital remained open. But a year later, then was Korean conflict, and that was a no-no. So anti-American fervor was all-time high, and you won't be safe as American living in China. So they were given the paperwork and driven out of China overnight, and so my mother was stuck. Yeah.
And she wasn't allowed to go with them.
Yeah, so she couldn't make it. By the time she made it back, it was spring of 1951.
Oh my gosh. And these are, just want to make sure we understand, these are medical missionaries that were American that had adopted your mom.
Yep.
Is that right? Oh, it
Yes,
makes
so
me
I
so
can
sad.
backtrack a little bit.
They were
So my
separated.
my grandfather, American grandfather, was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, and from a very blue-blooded New England family, right? Wealthy beyond belief and powerful too. Skipping through the details, somehow he was looking for a meaning of life and decided after he got his MD, decided to become a missionary in Asia. He chose China. And along with his wife, they built a hospital in the small fishing village on the banks of Yangtze River, one of the longest river in Asia or in China, right? Or even in this world. And my mother was born directly across on the northern banks. And then a few months later, so this will be 1931, a couple months later, uh, the river flooded, became one of the worst natural disasters in 20th century, killing upwards of 4 million people.
Oh,
But somehow my mother wasn't one of those 4 million people, and she miraculously lived because her biological mother was kind enough that didn't throw her on the roadside, let her die, because girls were not valued in China at the time. But her biological mother was looking for a home for her. And and they found this medical missionary couple. And then, well,
what a story.
my,
My
my
God.
American grandparents adopted my mom. My mother was 1 year old at the time.
What a beautiful story. You know, I have a friend who is Korean and she was found in literally in a garbage can and taken
Yeah.
to an orphanage. And a wonderful woman who had done a lot of Korean adoptions arranged for her adoption and then for her brothers. And she's had a
Mhm.
wonderful life and she's gone back to Korea. But it is
Mhm.
such a sad part of the story, the way
Yes,
that the babies were
it's a
handled. And I
very
never
sad part of the culture. I mean,
I
for
went to high
centuries.
school with this woman. She's my friend. I worked with her in high school.
Huh?
I
Yeah.
know her well. And I didn't know this story until, we're all older now and we're connected on Facebook. I didn't know this story until the last 10 years. And it broke my
Mhm.
heart. It broke my heart to think of my beautiful friend, that that's how she started
Mhm.
her life. But she prefers
Yeah.
to look at it as positive, as these beautiful angels who found her and took care of her. And she had a very beautiful trip back to Korea. So there is this unification, this,
Yeah.
getting back with your family and understanding that they all took care of you. They all care about you. And
Right.
she's
Oh
connected
yeah,
now. But
my mother would agree with her totally, completely. Yeah.
what a way to start your life. My God.
Yes. But starting from that point, she had the fortune of a meeting with many, many extraordinary human beings and wonderful human beings, or angel in disguise, if you will. And
Yeah.
that helped her get through some of the worst time, particularly. I'm not just even talking about my grandparents, but just the 30 years in China. So
Yeah. That's a long
really,
time.
yes, get through those tough times. Yeah.
And you can't help but think about how we're at the whim of a government and what they decide to do. And we're just trying to have lives. People are just trying to live their lives.
Peacefully and right. And, it's just, we're, yeah. And most of us, we don't need much. We don't ask much.
Yeah.
We just ask to be left alone.
Right. And in
Yeah.
spite of all that, your mother was, triumphant. She got educated, she got married, she built a life, she raised you. It's kind of
Yes,
amazing.
she didn't know. So she was 19 years old when her parents left China, driven out of China. And she was wondering, up to that point, she had a pretty charmed childhood, right? And so then she was wondering how she would survive. And then immediately at the moment, Chinese government made a rule that they need physicians, they need teachers. So she was already a freshman, sophomore in college, right? And so they decided to turn all these people into physicians or teachers. Whether that's right or wrong, my mother became a beneficiary of that policy, right? And
Yeah.
then they even waived the tuitions for this first generation of, I guess, kids post communist regime. And so, yeah, so then she, lo and behold, became an ophthalmologist. And then that also helped her during some of the worst time in China because just like how communist government allowed my grandparents allow some of the Americans to stay to keep the hospital operational, because they they need physicians, they need competent physicians, and they need a hospital. And so my doesn't matter how it didn't matter how they were persecuting my father or my mother actually got off a bit easy, relatively speaking, because she was allowed to work in the hospital. They need
Yeah.
to keep the hospital. Right. So right. It's
That
bizarre,
helped.
but yeah. Ironic, but yeah.
It is. You wonder too, you look back and realize all these twists and turns and how fortunate some of them are, and they didn't even seem on purpose. They're just sort of lucky accidents
Just
in a
happened.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Fate,
So
I
did
guess.
she keep in touch with her parents this whole time?
She was able to. So there were piles and piles of letters, and
Oh,
then she could sort them through by saying that actually I received them. These I never received them, right? Because they were all
oh,
censored. It
oh,
was
oh my gosh. I
way
didn't
back
even
in
think
the
of that.
early 1950s when communists just took over. They censored all the letters, right? And then so they were able to correspond at least here and there fleetingly for about 3 or 4 years until my American grandparents decided if they can't go back to mainland China, they can go to Taiwan and they can continue to help Chinese people. And that sounded wonderful, but that Taiwan was enemy of the state. Right. So
Oh,
by the time they went to Taiwan, my mother didn't dare to write anything to them, and whatever they wrote never got through. Right? So,
oh,
so they lost touch with one another around 1954 to 55. So, and then yeah,
that's a sad part of the story.
yeah. Well, it's war, right? It's
Right.
always yeah,
It's
man-made.
just good. It's good for us to hear about the human part of, like I said, what, governments do what they do, and then human
And then,
beings
and
have
then
to.
the civilians, people like you and I, yeah, we're just collateral damages, right? So,
It's
mm,
important to remember that there's humans just trying to make a go of their lives and just to survive.
yeah.
So I'm assuming she graduated and became an ophthalmologist.
Yeah.
And when did she meet your dad?
So they met in college. They had known each other actually when they were even younger. But again, World War II separated them, right? So they got rekindled, I guess, in college. And then I think looking back on even though they would tell me it was true love, and I could tell that it was probably a marriage of convenience. Also, there's an element of that because my mother was still a foreigner in her own country even by the time we
Oh,
came out we came to the States. But back in 1950s, my mother's Chinese was really bad, and she spoke with an accent. And when I got older, I was always
oh my
wondering
gosh.
why she spoke kind of funnily, right? So it's like, what? So now I completely understand. So I think was partially she realized she needs to assimilate and blend in, right? So marrying my father was the best way of blending in. There was that element, but maybe it was also love, right? So they were married in 19 I guess right around 1955 when she first realized she couldn't correspond with her parents anymore. So, right.
So did she ever get to see her parents again?
Uh, Yep, they passed away in 1958, 1963, respectively. And so, yeah, uh,
See, that makes me sad.
I know. And I guess the last time she saw them, she was 19 years old.
It's just hard to imagine. And it reminds me of what we take for granted, right?
Yeah, especially so there were some analogies, similarities there, right? So I came out. I didn't get to see. I have an older sister, so I didn't get to see my older sister till 20 some years later. And I didn't get to see
Wow.
my father till sometime in later 1980s, and so about a decade or so. So yeah, so it's like I mean, I actually to look back on, I never wanted to come to the States, right? Because I prefer, I mean, who wouldn't, right? Who wouldn't prefer just to be together with family? Why would you
Right.
want to be separate, right? But sometimes you do that because you're in a dire situation you want to run away from, right?
You have
So,
to do it. Right. I don't think people understand that who are safe and never had
yeah,
to consider something like that. It's really
right,
important to remember. Sometimes we have to leave.
right. I mean, no humans will be in their right mind will be want to be uprooted from their homeland and then try to go and speak a different language, meeting different people, completely
Yeah.
foreign and surrounding, right? They would much prefer to stay where they're
Yeah.
familiar with and speak their native language. So,
I think
right.
that's a really good point and something important to remember. And especially for Americans who, I've traveled a little bit and I'm maybe not as insulated as some Americans are really insulated. They haven't traveled much. It's a big country. Maybe they live in the middle of it. It's hard to understand sometimes
Right.
what it's like to change cultures, to be forced out of where you are. I mean, some people
Mhm.
have been here. Well, your grandfather was an exception because he left, but or your great grandfather. Some people have been here for hundreds of years. They just can't comprehend making such
Right.
a change. And it's important to realize that it's not the same everywhere, and there are reasons why people have to go, and it's drastic. I mean, the things you're describing are so drastic. The shifts in government,
Yes. So,
separation of
but
family. I
but
mean, it's tough.
you included, right? But you included your great grandparents or your ancestor came from somewhere, right? Migrated from
Well,
somewhere because they were fleeing something, right?
everybody,
I
right?
mean, or they were also or they were also looking for new
Yes.
opportunities to make
Actually,
it.
yeah, I never talk about this, but my
Yeah.
family's been here since the 1660s,
Uh-huh.
and they were fleeing religious persecution.
Go. Yeah.
There you
Right.
go. There you go. Right.
Yep.
What would drive you to do that? I mean, I
Yeah.
get it.
Right.
Like there's strong reasons, and we're all immigrants except for people that were brought here as slaves and Native Americans. In America, we are all
Yep.
immigrants,
Yep.
all of us.
Precisely. Yeah.
And
Totally. Yeah.
it's such an important point nowadays, and I'm so
Mhm.
glad that you brought that part of the story. So now that the book is done, what does that feel like? I can't even imagine.
Uh, well, I feel relieved. I guess that's a minimum
Yeah,
minimum feeling. I guess minimally.
yeah.
Uh, I I I think well to uh, to put it bluntly, it really changed me. I
Mhm.
think to the point where because what's so surprising about that? Well, I no longer look at things the same way, right? Anyway, for 30 some years, including training, maybe even longer than that, I just thought about one thing that would be chemistry and
Right.
later teaching. Although teaching is a career worthy of pursuit, and I'm again very grateful I had the opportunity. But I was very tunnel visioned, right? So I was just looking at what's my next research papers, publication, what's my next student's lecture, and when they're going to defend their thesis. And then writing this memoir made me sort of look up and uh, reading, thinking, seeing things. And so once I started doing that, whether I was in a library or looking at the internet or sort of searching on the internet or reading what my mother wrote or reading other people's writings, and again, learning, I suddenly realized I could never go back to to the, I mean, to teach chemistry the same way, at least, minimally at least. And and there were moments I even found myself standing in front of a class. I actually want to tell them I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about something else.
Oh,
But of course, I knew that would be wrong, right? Because they didn't sign up for a history class. They signed up for a chemistry class. So then I knew that was also a factor, or in part, why I decided I need to perhaps terminate my chemistry teaching career. So yeah, so I no, I think I look at things and think about things in a very different way, from very different perspectives. So
I think that's amazing that you, first of all, that you finished your promise to your mother. That is so beautiful. And second, that you expanded your mind that way. Like you really
yes,
literally said, I'm going to really learn, really research. And so you expanded your viewpoint and your mind, and you're not the same. You're not the same at all.
yeah, I know. So I that was kind of unexpected because I thought, okay, so it's a story about human life, a person's life, and so that person was born, that person lived, that person died, right? So that would have
Right.
been sort of the gist of it. But yet delving into deeply into her life, her stories. Uh, Her stories are unique, not because of her, but because of events, historical events that she had the fortune of encountering,
Yeah.
or unfortunate of encountering, and but are all the people that she met, and all the people that made a difference in her life, and
Yeah.
that was rich. So
Well, there's so
that
many
made
wonderful
me,
levels, right? Like there's that
yes,
historical backdrop that's fascinating
yes,
unto itself, but then all those other levels, people that came along and helped her, and her personal growth, and her education, and her the connections that you made were really interesting, probably things that you
yes,
probably never connected.
right.
Was there just some surprises in there that you didn't know about your mom?
Uh, Yeah, so we were talking about my mom, and I was telling you that even though I believe we loved each other deeply, but most of that probably was due to we were against the world, so to speak,
Oh,
after I came to the States, after she called America home, so she will often say after I return home, right? So anyway,
oh,
and so for those initial years, so we were very close to one another because I was hanging onto her shirt tail, right? So, um, but she was very strict, and she was of course smart, brilliant, and then again she would hold me to these lofty expectations that I hated it, right?
oh,
And then she has this sort of one side of her persona that she will show me. And just not a very loving, readily to show her love, right? A very different side that she would show other people. And but and I thought she was also courageous, brave, just this person I have to put on the highest pedestal I know of. But writing this memoir or completing her memoir, it's like, oh my goodness, she's human.
yeah,
She's just like rest of us, like me, made many mistakes, and she was afraid.
yeah,
She cried, she struggled. So I enjoyed that part because
yeah,
now I can put a face to this human being that I was putting on some kind of pedestal, unnecessarily, of course. Of course, I was a
yeah.
kid.
But we do that, and what a gift to get to know your mother in that
Yeah.
way.
Yes. Um, right. I know. And also, I wouldn't want to give the book away, but I could. Also, I knew she had deep friendship with several people back in 1960s, to the point where sometimes I wonder if my father was my father. So,
Ah, oh
and
no,
these were all things sort of dug out and
that
notes that
came
she
out.
left. She was unable to finish, stories that she was unable to finish. And she would sometimes she would have a photograph stuck to a piece of paper and with an arrow point to a face. Or it could be a guy, could be a gal, and she would say, "I got to talk about this person." It's just like, who the heck is that
Wow.
person?
And that's all in her
But
head, right?
I slowly
Yeah.
put things together. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Now, what about your sister? Does she live in America or is she in China?
She's now living in Boston.
Oh,
She
good.
finally immigrated here in early 2000s with her son. So her son at the time was about 6 years old, and now it's a grown adult, young adult, I guess. And so my sister suffers from cerebral palsy, and she was born early 1960s. I guess precisely probably 1960. I keep forgetting her age. She's about 6 or 7 years older than me. So, uh, and at the time, they thought it was polio, but it wasn't a virus, right? So then finally, by the time they figure out it was cerebral palsy, and there was no way I'll try to help her or save her or try to mitigate her such situation. So she has a physical handicap or physical challenge in terms of speech and walking and so on. But she managed to ultimately finish college in 1980s and became a librarian for most part of her life before retiring and immigrating to the States. Um, yeah, so like I was saying earlier, after I left China, I didn't see her for 20 some years.
I can't
Uh,
even imagine. But it's nice that she's,
yeah,
somewhat near.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yes, completely. Right.
And how did you meet your wife?
Oh, that's interesting. And I met her in, I guess, 1999 shortly after, maybe a couple years after I was divorced from my first wife. And my first wife was American, actually, born and raised in Indiana. And I actually we had a very good relationship, which is mutually parted our ways. And then this
That's good.
woman, my current wife is from actually was born in China and was a graduate student at Tulane medical school. And then there was a mutual friend between us, introduced us, and yeah, so then the rest is
That's
history, I guess.
great. And how long have you been married?
Officially, probably about 16 or 17 years. We
Mhm.
dated for a while, even though we were in two different locations, two different cities. Yeah,
So that worked out.
that's right.
So I'm wondering if I had spent all this time on my mother's book and it was finally done, I might not know what to do with myself, right? Because you were so invested and you were so living that. I mean, you gave up your career and you were living that book. Do you
Yeah.
feel like you know who you are now?
Um, no, is the short answer. And the long-winded answer is I'm trying to figure out who I am. And like what I was telling you earlier, I was rambling away, and I'm trying to tell you that I'm forever changed, right?
Right,
By completing her memoir, and I no longer look at things differently.
right,
And then I was also telling you earlier, before I came to the States in 1980, I had always wanted to be a writer, to become a journalist. Of course, writing in Chinese, and at that time
right,
that was on my mind.
right.
And of course, I was blindsided by coming to America. And so now I'm thinking maybe I can go back to become a writer. And but to write what? I mean, the last thing I want to do is write another memoir, right? So I'm already burned out on that. So this past year or so, I've become interested in just writing short stories, like 1,000 word, 800 word short essays about event, about a story of my life, in my life, or from my
Yeah.
past. And I'm not trying to write a memoir, but just something memorable. And again,
Yes. I
yeah,
was going to ask you earlier, do you think you're going to write? Because that doesn't go away. That pull, that first
yeah,
pull when you're young to what
yeah,
you want to do. And
yeah.
I think you have reflections. You have so many reflections and so many observations to bring to, um, your a readership like that.
I completely agree. Yep.
I would
I
read
think
it.
I want to
Yeah.
do that. I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to write another albatross about my
No,
life.
no,
My life
no,
is probably nowhere near as interesting as my mom's, but there'll be stories, and
yeah.
reflections like what you said I
Well,
have.
you
And
just have this unique, you know, like it or not, right? That's your legacy, this unique bicultural, awareness of
yes,
how history touches us and changes us. And I would read that book. I think that's a great way to go, is to
yes.
share your
Mhm,
reflections and your thoughts. And
mhm.
those are stories that people need to hear. They need to, the thoughtful kind of, um, I don't know what the word is. I'm losing my words. Like the thoughtful rumination almost on
Right,
the
right.
intersection of these things that you
Yes.
uniquely can speak to, and people
Uh-huh.
want to learn, they want to understand, and I think that would help a
Yes.
lot.
So I think I think that's why this past year or so, or 10 months or so, here and there, I'm trying not to put pressure on myself, but
Oh,
one essay a month, so to speak, just
that's
take my
great.
time, have a first draft, and look at
Yeah.
it, and then some of my American relatives are they're authors or writers. And one of them actually encouraged me to collect some of these short stories and essays. And so maybe someday you can collate them into a book. And that will be a memoir like,
No,
but not
no.
quite, right? Like we say, it's a
Yeah.
collection of
Yeah.
reflections, right? So the thoughts
Yeah.
and the perspectives. Yes.
Those are some of
Based
my
on
favorite
real
kinds of
events.
writing. Yeah.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
love that kind of writing because it really makes
Mhm.
you think,
I-
and you have a lot to bring to it. So is there anything that we missed? Is there anything you would like to tell our readers that we might have not said? Any piece of advice or anything I didn't get to?
don't easily promise your parents anything.
Oh, what a great lesson. Oh my God. And how can people get your book? How can people
Um,
get that book?
yeah, Amazon.com, Barnes Noble. If you type in spring flower and then
Spring
Jim,
Flower.
yeah, it will pop up.
And is there a way to contact you that if people want to talk to you or ask you questions or
Yes, I finally built a website for the book,
okay,
for the memoir. So it will be Richard Perkins Hsung. So my full name spelled out letter by letter, and then .com, and we'll have all the information there. Yeah.
that's great. I'll put it in the show notes too, but some people don't read the show notes, so it's good to say it out loud. Well, Richard, I could talk to you for another day, I think.
Me too.
I appreciate so much that you told us your story. It's a beautiful one, and I mean, I'm a mom and it just really moves me what you've done for your mom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.